Are we live here? Do we have people in the Zoom regard? Let's see.
Yes, we are live. Yeah,
Awesome. Thanks, Caroline. Got it.
of course.
Awesome.
Yes.
Shiba, awesome. All right. It's it's so amazing. Let's see the okay. It's okay. Look at this. Look at what you have to navigate here. You know, like what? How do I get to the view gallery? Okay, there we go. Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. All the people whose faces we can see and all the faces that are hidden. We're happy to see you on Shabbat morning. We're going to start with the blessings of the Torah. We're going to try to end a little bit earlier today because there's a bar mitzvah across the street, and I want to get there a little bit early to make the kid feel a little bit like, okay, there's a rabbi that's going to be here for my bar mitzvah. Okay. All right, so Caroline, thank you so much for your moderating and putting up the Birchot Torah. Okay, thank you. So let's make the blessing. Can people see it? I don't think you can see it yet.
Sorry, 1 second.
That's okay. There we go. Thank you. Baruch atah Adonai. No? Log b'divrei. Amen. So this week's portion and more is roughly. We could divide it into a couple of pieces. The general breakdown of the parsha is that the beginning of the parsha and most of the parsha is dealing with kohanim, with priests, and most of it is essentially like the division of the. Let me just give you the division before we get to. It's mostly kohanim dealing things having to do with the priesthood, and then towards the end of the parsha we have the famous litany or the list of the chagim, of the holidays. And from which we have the well-known verse, Ele Moadei Adonai Asher Tikru Otam V'Moadam. These are the Moadim, these are the appointed times. But most of the parsha is connected with the Kohanim. And this is where Rabbi David Hoffman, in his understanding of Leviticus, breaks down the general structure of this parsha. He says, just as the people of Israel called Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests from amongst all of the nations, and we have therefore responsibility to walk in the ways of what is known as Kiddusha, holiness. So too, we have already within the children of Israel one tribe, Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi. They were also chosen as well to be at an even more greater level of holiness or a greater level of dedication to the holy. And then they have a certain behavior patterns, just as we have behavior in the general sense, as the children of Israel have a general responsibility an obligation to behave according to the Torah. There's Torah within the Torah of the Levites, the Torah of the Kohanim, and they also have a greater level of holiness expected of them. And in this parsha, we have 5 different halakim, 5 different sections, and there are some subsections. So in the first section, the Kohanim, the priests, are to be kadosh to God. They're to be holy to God, and particularly even amongst the priests, there's the big kahuna, the Kohen Gadol, the great Kohen, and that's kind of the first section. The second section deals with Kohanim, or priests who have some kind of bodily defect and therefore they can't serve. In the third section, there have the Kohanim or the priests have to be distance themselves specifically from tum'ah, anything having to do with impurity. And those who are also not Kohanim also have a similar responsibility, not to come towards the holy. And then in the final 2 sections, the Kohanim, the priests, they have to make sure that which is being given to the altar also has to have no blemishes. Just as the priest can't come with a blemish, that which is being offered has to be blemish-free. And then right? Then the last sections of laws having to do with coming with the korbanot, with the sacrifices. So you essentially have like three large portions of priestly responsibilities divided into five areas. All of them have to do with what is the level of holiness that a priest has to have, and then what is the level of holiness of the things the priest brings to the altar. And then the end of the parsha has to do with the holidays and those specific times where people would come, presumably, to the temple and have an extra level of work for the Kohanim. So even within those halakim, and with those subdivisions, you have a series of verses having to do with a korban or a sacrifice that is not to be brought before the eighth day of that sacrifice's life, and also a responsibility not to slaughter a mother and her calf as well on the same day. And so generally, within the mivneh, within the structure of the parsha, this has to do with what is appropriate to bring to the altar for the kohen. That's where it falls in those subsections. But obviously, it raises all kinds of questions about the purpose of the korbanot, of the sacrificial rites, and compassion versus not compassion. So we're going to look at these verses that are in like what makes for an appropriate korban, what makes for an appropriate sacrifice, and what are some of the reasons given for these seemingly for these strange rules, right? Eighth day, not eighth day, mother, child, what's going on here? Like the whole sacrificial system seems to be problematic. Why only these two things? So let's look at those and see how the rabbis and the like traditional commentators looked at it. We'll have a conversation, and you'll see that it'll break down in a moment into a number. It will become a conversation about kind of pan meta religious conversation about what the function of religion is or function of mitzvot. They'll move from this very small atomized moment, like to interrupt this conversation about the technicalities of what korban, what sacrifice, the timing of it and so on, to a much bigger macro conversation about the purpose of all of this in a moment. So let's look at I'll share the screen. I also shared the source sheet with y'all, and let's go there. Okay. And okay, there we go. Okay, great. Can you guys see it on the screen? Yeah? Awesome, great. Okay. So, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, verse 26 in chapter 22. God spoke to Moses, the Lord, spoke to Moses saying, when an ox, shor, or chesed, which is a sheep, or ez, a goat, ki yivaled, when they are born. It's a very strange, anyway, it's a strange grammatical form, but when in their being born, v'haya shivat yamim tachat imo, let the calf be 7 days with its mother, umiyom hashmini v'hala, and from the 8th day forward, yeratzeh, it will be acceptable korban for an offering, ishe, by a fire offering, ladonai, for Adonai, for God. Yeah? Verse 28, very similar beginning. Veshor, oseh, right now an ox and I guess it says an animal from the herd here, but it's also a kind of, it's not a goat, but it's from the flock, that's what they say, right? Oto ve'edvino, that offering and its son or child, lo tishchatu b'yom echad. Even on the 8th day, right? Lo tishchatu b'yom echad. Right? V'chitis b'chuz zebach l'Adonai l'irtzochem tizbachus, verse 29, which we don't have to get into. It has to be l'ratzon, it has to be acceptable if it's a Thanksgiving offering. It's a Todah offering. Okay. So what's going on here with the 7 and 8, and then what's going on with the not being slaughtered on one day? Okay, so here's Ibn Ezra, source number 3. Source number 3, Ibn Ezra says that there's a connection between circumcision, like a child that is circumcised, right? That is until a quarter of the month has passed. The Ibn Ezra was an astrologer. And so he believed in like the number 7, so there are 28, like a kind of a quarter of the month is 1 week, and it's kind of a quarter of the moon cycle. So he wanted it to be somehow connected to that. But what's more instructive here is the connection to the eighth day of the child, as if, like, why is that relevant? Why is the eighth day of a circumcision? Is he saying here that there's a magical number eight until you're 8 days old, right? That you're not really fully formed until your eighth day as a human being, and on the eighth day you become fully formed. Until that point you're still what's called a nefel. You're still like in utero in some way, and that somehow the gushpanka of eight, like eight, is already like, oh, now just like a circumcision is the gemar, the finishing as it were of the body, which is a common trope in rabbinic literature. The body is incomplete until there's a circumcision. So this baby, or this I guess this calf, is not a complete animal, and so you can't bring an incomplete animal to the mizbeach, to the altar. Okay, like what? Okay, so Maimonides also, Maimonides in source number 4. Look at source number 4. Maimonides seems to echo this magical eight business. Like something about the number 8 here, like one could easily ask a broader question, which is maybe wait 5 years, maybe wait 3 years. Like why, an 8-day-old child is by no means complete, maybe physically, but like it's just a strange emphasis on the number 8 here. It's also interesting because it connects it to circumcision. Like it's another 8. We have 8 in the Torah. We have the 8th of circumcision. We have the 8th day of Sukkot later on in this parsha. But okay. Let's look at what Maimonides says. Maimonides, Maimonides, according to his general approach, is going to be a bit rational, try himself to make sense of what would normally not make sense. But he wants to give reasons for this. He thinks that the Torah is better with reasons than without. It's more palatable and more digestible, right? Not just a bunch of laws that are given willy-nilly. But what's the reasoning? What's the rationale? So he says, the circumcision must take place on the 8th day because all living beings are after birth within the first 7 days very weak and exceedingly tender as if they were still in the womb of their mother. And not until the 8th day can they be counted among those that enjoy the light of the world. That this is also the case with beasts may be inferred from the words of Scripture. 7 days shall it be under the sun as if it had no vitality before the end of that period. In the same manner, man is circumcised after the completion of 7 days. The period has been fixed and has not been left to everybody's judgment. So what's Maimonides' rational explanation? I mean, I find it, okay, what's Maimonides saying? Does he add anything to Ibn Ezra? Or, I mean, they're contemporaneous. Is he adding anything here? More words. Besides more words, right? It's true. Definitely more words. Certainly, if you wanted to say there was something between Ibn Ezra and Maimonides, and there was a lot between them, differences, but certainly Maimonides was more loquacious than Ibn Ezra.
It's
Yeah,
a
Nikki.
physiological explanation.
He gives he actually unpacks what's assumed, right? Like Ibn Ezra doesn't explain, he just makes an intertextual connection between the 8 of one and the 8 of another. But Maimonides wants to actually say that we have a proof, as it were. There's a proof, since circumcision is 8 days, and we all know that the reason for that is because the first 7 days you're not fully formed, you're too tender, but then on 8th day, somehow magically you go from being extremely tender to being now, it's just remarkable. Like when you read it, you think, Maimonides was so brilliant, and he was such a, I mean, there is no medical evidence to show that on the 8th day you magically become more, viable than you were in the first week. It's not like there's a certain number of hours a week's worth of hours now on the 8th day, the body. There's no evidence to point to that, and it seems to be arbitrary, frankly, or symbolic. And none of those things are where Maimonides wants to go, because he feels strongly he's writing a polemical treatise to those Jews who would find Judaism to be too magical or too dogmatic, whatever it is. But so he says, everybody seems to know from circumcision that you're not you're too tender. So from that, I see. From that, there's a proof that when it comes to animals, the same dynamic is happening. The reason why the Torah demands that the eighth day is when the animal becomes a viable animal to be offered on the altar is because it's not yet a fully formed animal or fully viable. And the 8th day, as is proof, how do you know that the 8th day is the day when it becomes viable? From circumcision. But how do you know from circumcision that it's the 8th day, it's when that you're less tender? Okay, okay, okay. So Wendy, and then Rachel.
Maimonides, being a physician, I think, had the bent to sort of come up with a medical or a scientific explanation of it. Though there is something that is known medically, that on the eighth day, the liver begins to fabricate the clotting enzymes that are necessary. I don't
Only
think
on the eighth day?
on the liver begins to produce the clotting factor on the eighth day. I don't think Maimonides, as a physician, had that information at the time, but
Highly unlikely. Is it really true, Matt?
yeah,
I never heard that.
the liver begins
Did anybody else ever hear that
to
before?
create the clotting factor.
Anybody online ever hear that? Asher, anybody ever hear that that the eighth day there are biological processes that begin only on the eighth day to clot blood?
Well, let's say approximately on the eighth. With,
I'm fascinated. That's actually fascinating to me.
plus minus a couple of days,
And it's not left for your judgment. It's been,
Right. So my mommy says, listen, the eighth, of course, what he says, yeah, it's not left open for interpretive, which is also a good thing. Otherwise, we'd have people saying, circumcision on any, one would say 12. But of course, the commandment for the eighth day is from God, right? It's early on in the Torah. And it would seem that given that the Torah is so fascinated with the number 7 and 8 is one day after 7, there is a symbolic, like the Rambam might not want to go in the symbolic, highway here. That might not be an intellectual interest for all kinds of reasons, but it really begs the question because it seems that 8 is a very deeply symbolic number. 7 is a deeply symbolic number, and 8 is connected. It's within a genus. Anyway, so these are interesting. Yeah, Rachel, and then
This is so ridiculous.
yeah.
First of all, if Maimonides is talking to the Jewish community, this is not the Jewish community's first practice of circumcision. The only the only medical evidence he would have is circumcision that by tradition is always in 8 days. So it wouldn't matter if, he just doesn't have any scientific data. The other thing is that being poor, when I had my first baby, I remember the hospital, in its fiscal wisdom, threw me out in 2 days. And somewhere within the 2 days, my baby got circumcised. I requested circumcision so that the baby would look like his father, who was circumcised. And my 2 babies were 6 feet tall. No harm came to them for 50 years. So I have medical evidence that, they my kids were not so frail that they couldn't have circumcision early because the one I lost was 50 years old when I lost him. I mean, I have the medical evidence. Maimonides did not.
Yeah, so I want to acknowledge that this is not a class on circumcision. So I want to just broadly. I get it. It's not anyone's fault. It's by the nature of Ibn Ezra and Maimonides both bringing in circumcision when we're talking about 8th day, which is of course a natural. They wouldn't talk about Hanukkah, which is another 8th day, but they'll talk about circumcision, which is the earliest symbolic.
Yeah.
Right, and that's with circumcision. I'll say that. That the underscoring here, the absurd. I find it also difficult. I wouldn't call it crazy, but I'd say it's difficult. And I'd say that it leaves. It's like what they say. The ikar is chaser min hasefer. Like it's not. There's a lot left to be desired here in this parallel, because I feel as though the 8th. It does. It's as if they're working from. The fact that the Torah said 8 days around this animal, is where they begin from. It's not as though the a priori assumption is that there must be like they learned that there has to be, the animal can't be sacrificed in the first week, But then it says 8, so they say it's like a circumcision. You can't sacrifice the animal, you can't sacrifice. But like, it's something is lacking. And you'll see in a moment that there are others who go in a very different direction. And I guess I would just say one thing about Maimonides. He was speaking to a Jewish community that was like our community. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with parents who don't want to circumcise their children. And so for the Rambam, Maimonides is trying to convince people that it's not, like, it's actually good for the child, right?
So they were
This is a polemical treatise. It's the guide for the perplexed. There are people who are perplexed, like there are today, and legitimately so. And the Rambam is trying to give his best foot forward. Like, here's why you should have a circumcision, which is something that, as rabbis, also try. I'm not nearly as strong in my advocacy as Maimonides, because I have 3 boys and I understand the terror. And I also understand the barbarity of it and feeling that it's barbarous and so on.
Right.
And so I will often resort to medical explanations, not to say that you should do it, but that there's no conclusive evidence, so to speak, that it's problematic or that it's painful. So, but I get it. It's a very problematic practice. Trust me. I struggle with it. Yeah, go ahead. I'm not here to advocate for.
No, I'm not advocating one way or the other for circumcision, but I am interested in 2 things. One, the equivalence between non-human animals and animals,
Mm-hmm.
and human animals, right?
Mhm,
So
right.
from a anti-speciesist
Yeah.
perspective, it's kind of interesting to see
Yes.
no separation between humans and others.
Yes.
And then
You'll see later. We'll come back to that in a little bit later. In the extent of that, like, it really gets walked out.
Fascinating,
Yeah.
yeah. And then secondly, of course, underlying all of this is the question, a little bit of the question of the abortion debate, because the date
Viability.
of birth,
Yeah.
is that viability, or what about 8 days before birth?
Right.
So it's kind of an interest. So there seems to be a desire to create arbitrary. It feels arbitrary to us as moderns looking at
Right.
what we know.
Yeah.
But there is an attempt here to kind of create stages of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are, again, we're not for the fact that that's entirely true and well said. There's an extensive body of literature on abortion within Judaism, and on viability of fetal viability. And indeed, this is one of the texts that is brought in, and the understandings around the text, but that's a much bigger conversation. And so I want to just move now into, thank you for all those comments. I don't see any hands up in the Zoom. We got,
A quick translation question. What's the word in the original Hebrew that becomes sacrifice in English?
Korban.
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 And what's the etymology of that?
To bring close.
To bring
near.
close.
Yeah. So let's connect this to the next series. If you turn the page, just to page 2, source number 6, you'll see a different approach to the number 7, number 8 here, and why it's significant. So let's look at the Tur Ha'aruch, source number 6. Shor or chesed or eitz ki v'gomer, an ox or a goat that will be born, etc. After the Torah had given us a list of animals unwelcome on the altar due to various kinds of blemishes, it now adds a new type of disqualification, i.e., being underage, what's called michusar zman, like lacking age, lacking time, less than 7 days old. Even though these animals do not display any blemish, being too young or too old can also disqualify an animal as a potential sacrifice. Some commentators claim that the reason is that if one were to sacrifice an animal on the very first day it was born, some onlookers might construe this as an homage to that day, the first day of heaven and earth existed. Similarly, offering such a young animal on any other of the 7 days of its first week on earth might be misinterpreted as some form of idolatry. Hence, after a whole week has elapsed, such a misinterpretation of the owner's intention is impossible. By waiting at least 7 days before offering a newly born animal as a sacrifice, this amounts to an acknowledgement that God created the universe in 6 days and that God rested on the 7th day. This is also similar to the next source, the Midrash Tanchuma, a little Midrash a little later in the first millennia. Rabbi Yehoshua of Sichnin said in the name of Rabbi Levi, or Levi, the situation is similar to a king, mashal, to a king who entered a province where he issued a proclamation, said, let no strangers who are here see my face before they first see the face of my matron, my wife. Similarly, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Israel, my children shall not approach me with an offering until the Shabbat queen has passed over it. For there are no 7 days without a Shabbat, and there's no circumcision without the passing of a Shabbat. Rabbi Isaac said, an ordinance for humanity and an ordinance for beasts are on a par. An ordinance for humanity, and on the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, and an ordinance for the beasts, and from the 8th day on it shall be acceptable for an offering to God. So both of these sources draw not the circumcision connection. Of course, the circumcision connection is there, but the reason for waiting is not because of viability. The reason for waiting is, number one, because in waiting, one shows that none of those first 7 days are as important as the passing of 7 days. And in the passing of 7 days, one gives homage not to the god of Wednesday or the god of, Saturn or whatever it might be, but one is giving, that then the 8th day sacrifice has had Shabbat, which is a testimonial to God's ultimate power over all of creation. In other words, one hasn't separated those 7 days as a unit. One sees all 7 days as part of a general temporal testimonial, right? Like in 7 days, God creates the world, and now I'm waiting for the end of that, and I show my fealty to that belief, and then I can bring an offering. That's the first source. That's the Torah Aruch. And the second source says something similar, not clear exactly if. In the second source, it's not clear if it's about worshiping, right, idolatry or something about the mashal, the parable. The king comes into the province and says, before you see my face, you have to see the face of my queen, and the queen is Shabbat. So all of these, like Shabbat has the power of the queen or some such thing. It's not clear why the king wants you to see the queen's face. Like, why, like, is it humility? Is it because she's prettier than me? Is it because she's so beautiful? And like, once you've seen her, you'll know that, I have the ability to choose people. I know how to choose. Like, why is that? What's motivating the king? But like both of them they reduce the emphasis. Almost nothing is placed on the viability of the sacrificial animal. Its disqualification doesn't come because it might be it's not of age, michusar zman. It's not that it's not old enough. It's that it hasn't yet seen Shabbat. And 7 days, like everything that's offered to God has to have, we passed through Shabbat once, kind of thing. Now, like whenever I talk about this vis-a-vis circumcision, I say, well, of course, Shabbat has healing properties. So the baby's even stronger when Shabbat has, it's experienced Shabbat. That's kind of the way that a lot of commentators say that. But this is the second approach to this strange 8-day sacrificial moment. Yes, Paul, and then Paul, you're going to say something, and then we'll see if anybody inside.
So it occurs to me that the primary distinction here is, should there be passing of time before these events happen or not?
Right.
Why aren't they immediate?
Right.
And for me, when I read this for the first time, I went to the mother, that there were the feeling among the community that the mother should have some time with her newborn before other things happen. So then the question becomes, how much time? And so now that's what we're talking about. But the important decision is that there is time.
Let's go. Since you brought it up, let's go to it. Okay. Let's go to. I want to just go to what Paul said, and then I'll come back to you, Jay and Amy. Okay. Just give me a second. Let me go. If you turn to source number 10, Yitzchak Arama, the Akedat Yitzchak, a very, very oft quoted philosophical treatise. And he talks about the number 7. We're on page, I guess it's page 3, source number 10. Source number 10. So he quotes the earlier Vayikra commandment that you shall abide at the door of the tent of meeting day and night for 7 days and keep the charge of God. This is around the 7-day consecration of the Mishkan, called Shivat Yimei HaMiluim. There were 7 days, a week-long consecration of this holy portable synagogue. It says God, in God's superior wisdom, commanded Aaron and his sons on entering their holy service to observe an inaugural period of 7 days in which to contemplate and gain comprehension on the holy charge of the infinite. And during these 7 days, they were not allowed to leave the sanctuary, but were to spend them in the house of God. Their stay was to stimulate them to ponder on the divine work of creation and realize God's power and window. Such meditation leads human beings to love and serve God. This is the purpose of a 7-day period of seclusion, which should aid a sensitive person to become fully conscious of their task, just as the priests were enjoined to do upon their consecration, in order to bring home to them their holy task of serving God, the creator of all things, omnipotent and omniscient, and their obligations to divest themselves of their everyday garments, replacing them by the holy vestments. It was a week-long preparation for this, right? This approach is of the utmost importance for any sensitive person who aspires to perfection, or we could just call to evolve and to improve. An excellent example is the commandment, it shall remain 7 days with its mother, and from the 8th day, and it shall be acceptable. Just as an animal is not fit for the altar before this special 7-day period, and its vitality has been proved, so also should any discerning person allow themselves 7 days of preparation before embarking upon their enterprise. Now, this is not exactly what you were saying, Paul, but it's yet another 7 days. It doesn't connect it to creation. He connects it to a 7-day period of preparation before being ready to serve God. But if you look at source 12, right, there is a connection between of compassion around the verse of don't slaughter the mother and child on the same day. Now, but there isn't the 7-day period is not connected though to allowing the mother and the child to be together for a week. That I didn't see. But you'll see in a moment that there is a sensitivity towards the pain of the animal with its young. But it is I think it's natural to think that that's what's going on too. It's not just about the day, the same day. It's about like it would be cruel to take that. You'll see it later. We'll see it in the Shiluch HaKhan story when they send away the motherboard to take the baby. So there is that sentiment. But there are those you'll see in a moment who are vehemently opposed to approaching this from a place of compassion. And that's hard to believe, but maybe you'll see in a second. Okay, Jay, Amy, Marilyn, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to recast or revisit the notion of viability. We may not know, and certainly they probably did not know back
Can't hear
then.
you. Is it us or is it Jay?
I'm not muted. Oh,
Yeah, no, Jade, like, is totally, Jay's cool, yeah.
Go ahead. We hear you now. Sorry.
yeah.
Somehow we were.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. I want to recast the notion of viability. We may not know at what point is there enough vitamin K for the infant to clot, and they probably didn't know it back then. The only thing we know for certain is that in a period of 8 days, there will have been a Shabbat. That's the only thing we know for certain. So the viability may not be a physical viability. It might be a spiritual viability. It might be the notion that there's a gushpanka. You know, you've passed Shabbat, you're viable. And so now we can do whatever we need to do in terms of life, in terms of ritual, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to articulate what I think those commentators who were approaching it from that angle. Yeah, I think that's a nice Yiddish way to say it. They get the approval. Shabbat, passed over Shabbat. Shabbat approved. Yeah, exactly. Okay, Yeshikoach. Go ahead, Amy.
Shabbat Shalom. I would like to offer up 4 concepts. One has to do with survivability. If it's you don't want anything damaged, it goes big discussion of not providing damaged sacrifices. So that's one. Second is the cruelty to the mother. That
We'll get to that, yeah.
the mother also has. We have to answer. Onkelos tells us the law may teach humans to have compassion for all of God's creatures, recognizing that animals have feelings, or might teach that the underage beast is not suitable. But the a lot of the
Yeah, well,
commentators
Amy,
point
Amy,
to
we're gonna
cruelty.
get we're gonna get to that in a second. So the
But
compassion piece. Yeah.
Okay, and Rashi dissents against the concept of circumcision because he says it applies to both male and female sacrifices.
Right.
Mm.
Right. Got it. That's It just depends on how close the analogy is. It's not a borrowed analogy for male animals. It's just borrowing from. Anyway, I get yes, exactly. Okay, thank you, Amy. Rabbi Asher, Shkoyach, Amy, go ahead, Asher.
Just a quick little quibble. Vishor oseh oto et beno. It's using the generic, whether from the herd or from the flock. He and his offspring shall not be sacrificed on the same day. Whether it's he and she, not clear, but it's in contradistinction to tachat imo, which is specifically feminine. Dibarti.
Right, point well taken. But I think that the context matters here because if it's like removing the calf from within the first days, presumably it's still connected to the mother literally, and so that made sense there. But in the the osavas beno lo tishchatu b'yom echad is at any point, right? It could be months or a year. So it's clear it could be any animal. So that's a context specific, but point well taken. But let's look at the commandment against sacrificing the animal with its child or with its calf on the same day, and then extend that conversation backwards towards the conversation about the 7-day waiting period before the 8th day, and let's bring in the complication of how to understand these what seems to be cruel, a level of cruelty that is that's very troubling for us. Let's look at source number 12 with Maimonides here.
Hey, sorry, Rabbi David. I just wanted to point out that Marilyn was raising her hand. Has been raising her hand.
Oh, thank you, Caroline. Yeah, Marilyn, go ahead, Marilyn. Sorry, didn't see you.
Hi, Shabbat Shalom. I'm
Shabbat
very
shalom.
moved by the idea that both the child and the animal needs to experience a Shabbos, because for me, it changes the participant into, they are now part of the experience. So both the baby and the animal has had a profound experience of God in Shabbos, and now they will be able to participate in the circumcision / sacrifice in a different way. And just one more comment that I wanted to make is that we were separated. We, descendants of Adam and Eve, were separated on the 8th day. So that we also goofed it on the 6th day, got Shabbos on the 7th day, and then were kicked out, separated on the 8th day.
Yeah, those are all the yes. Yes, let's say yes to those. I need to go to the Maimonides. I'm sorry, and we'll come back in a second. Okay, so let's go forward to Maimonides because I want to actually, as I said earlier, I want to move from the specifics of this, circumcision and korbanot into the macro meta conversation about difficult or problematic mitzvot or things that lack rationale. And the way the rabbi struggled with this, just like us. So let's look at Maimonides, and then we'll see a number of other sources. So he writes in the Guide for the Perplexed in source 12 that the commandment concerning the killing of animals is necessary because the natural food of man consists of vegetables and of the flesh of animals. It is not allowed to torment the animals by cutting the throat in a clumsy manner, by poleaxing or by cutting off a limb while the animal is alive. It is also prohibited to kill an animal with its young on the same day. So he groups all of these things together in order that people should be restrained and prevented from killing the two together in such a manner that the young is slain in the sight of the mother. For the pain of the animal under such circumstances is very great. There is no difference in this case between the pain of humans and the pain of other living beings. Since the love and the tenderness of the mother for her young ones is not produced by reasoning, but by imagination, and this faculty exists not only in man, but also in most living beings. So the Rambam, in his own understanding of human, of of human faculties, right? The rational functioning is a very highly evolved capacity in the brain, but all of us have what he calls the imagination, which could be his way of talking about what Aristotle called the passions. Like you feel for something viscerally, it's somatic, it's lived, it's not from rational thought. But here you see something profound. He extends compassion to all living beings, and so he reads this commandment through the lens of any feeling, sentient, human being can know what it feels like to do something to a human being. We wouldn't do it to a mother, right? And to a child. We shouldn't do it to a mother cow, right? And to its and to the cow's offspring. Now, this all feels like, oh, that's great. Like, look at this compassion, Maimonides. Thank you so much. Of course, what's the problem with Maimonides' perspective? I mean, does anybody have a problem with Maimonides? Not logic, not from a place of rational or logical. Like nobody thinks that his sentiment is wrong. Of course, I think all of us think that that's true, right? But if he's right, what would be the upshot of if he's right?
The animal is killed.
No,
Yeah.
no sacrifice.
There should be no sacrifices.
That's right.
What do you like? Right, like, oh, so yeah, that's a level of brutality that we're just not going to. We can't countenance that. But on the eighth day, or if it's 2 different days, like you can kill the mother on Tuesday, but make sure you kill the child on Wednesday. Like what? Like, so this is the problem. And this, by the way, it's not just the problem with Maimonides. You have to understand this has been the problem for 2,000 years with those who tried to make sense of Torah, meaning the rabbis were decidedly ambivalent, and that's I'm being very generous here. Ambivalent. They were opposed. Many the rabbinics in the Talmud, they were opposed to giving reasons for mitzvot because they knew that the minute you started to give rationale for mitzvot, you would run into things that you didn't understand or things that you thought you understood and then thought, I could figure out a better way to do that. And once you start understanding the deeper structure of mitzvot and try to ask yourself, why did God ask me to keep kosher? Then it's 5 seconds before you say, that makes no sense. And since God also wants me to be a rational being, which is I have to express my humanity through my faculties of reasoning and so you have explicit mention in the Talmud that mitzvot, we don't know the reasons for mitzvot. Mitzvahs behind Amalek, like we don't know, but you couldn't suppress the reasoning. So the Talmud also gives reasons for mitzvot. So you have this ambivalence in the Talmud between understanding mitzvot. They say you can't understand mitzvot. Don't try to make sense of them in that way. You're just reducing them to your own human structures. God is a little bit brighter than all of us. And then you have right, and then you have Maimonides. You have others. Right, the Bahag, you have Sefer Chinuch, you have literally an entire medieval schools of thought that arose to give what are called ta'amei mitzvot, the reasons or the tam, the flavor of a mitzvah. And in other words, you have both a warning, and then you also have people who broke the rules and said they had to. Nikki, and we have to go further. Otherwise, we have to see. Other people also disagreed with Rambam, so I want to see them. Yeah.
Am I alone in thinking, why are we reading this stuff?
No, you're not alone, but I'm not. I'm going to bring it back. I'll bring it back at the end. Okay? Yes, quickly.
Okay, so I think we have a larger problem.
Yeah.
Which is that, so in last week's text, it talks about being compassionate, everything we believe today.
Yes.
Right? But we have texts before that talk about Jews in war and how you have to kill everybody. And this week, we have all of these uncompassionate things again, where it says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Let's keep going. We'll get to that. Okay, look at source number 13.
But my question was, how do we make sense?
I know that's your question.
Okay.
Right. There's no other question that could emerge from you. We're going to say put a microphone in my face. I got it. So source number 13. Let's turn to 13. 13. Okay.
Must be a reason.
In Deuteronomy 22, we have this very well-known passage. If you find, you're on the road and you find a bird's nest. If you see it in the tree, or it doesn't matter where it is, if it's on the ground, there are fledglings, little chickies, or eggs. And you see the mother is now sitting on or hovering over the beitzim, over the eggs. Lo tikach em al banim. You're not allowed to take the mother together with her young. Right? This is known in the literature of Chazal, of the rabbis, as Shiluach Hakan. You are to send away the mother bird if you want to take the eggs, right? You can't just move the hen off of the eggs and just take the eggs and say, right? And so what's the reason for this? What is the reason? In fact, this is one of the only two mitzvot in the Torah, two commandments in the Torah that there's a promise of reward, right? Milton Steinberg wrote a book called As a Driven Leaf, which put both of those mitzvot, the honoring of your parents and sending away the mother bird, in tension with each other, with a famous story in the Talmud about a child who honored his father and went to send away the mother bird and died tragically. And right, it's a very amazing book. So what's going on here? The Torah doesn't say why we're doing this. It doesn't say because how dare you send, So presumably it's because we have to have compassion for the mother, right? Compassion for the mother demands that if we're going to at least take the eggs, you can take the eggs, but do it in a way that's maximizing compassion. Don't be cruel. So that seems to prima facie to be that's the reason for it. Although it's not explicitly said in the Torah, that is, presumably that's the reason for it. But look at the 2nd century Mishnah in Masechet Brachot, in source 14, right? It is the case, the Mishnah in Brachot, the law is, if somebody says, Ha'omer al kansi pur yagiu rachamecha, have compassion for this bird's nest, right? If you say that, and then you say, and therefore give us compassion, as you told us to be compassionate for the mother bird, have compassion on us. The Altov yizacher shemecha, another phrase, may your name be mentioned with a good, or modim, we thank you, we then silence them. This Mishnah is this. Oh, it's okay. So okay. This Mishnah seems to be setting a limit liturgically on what one is permitted to say liturgically. That lends itself to heresy. So if you say thank you, the rabbis were worried you were praying to two gods. Modim, thank you. Like, wait a second, thank you for one God. What's the second thank you? So it was a period of great sectarianism, and the rabbis were trying to delineate liturgical anomalies, liturgical heretical moments that were that were heterodox, right? That would say like, oh, you gave someone the permission to have the microphone. By the way, it happens here at Rome all the time. It happens here at Rome all the time. Somebody would give someone the microphone to get up and say a blessing over the Torah. And people have their own blessings. And some of them come from Reconstructionist backgrounds. They refuse to call God the one who chose us from the people. Like, we have a very wide, very broad umbrella for the permissible from our bima, right? And many liberal synagogues do too. You can pray to the Shekhinah. You don't have to say it's God. You can say it's the divine feminine. Like, you don't have to use God. We're very broad. But the rabbis in the 2nd century were not so broad. And there were good reasons for that. It was the birth of Christianity. There was a lot more at stake. It was a nascent movement, right? You don't play with the brand when you're a nascent movement. You have to be like, So they said you're not one of the things that got you into trouble was if you said, may your compassion extend to us in the way that your compassion, right, mandated that we send away the mother bird. And the rabbis were not happy with that. And the reason why, they give the reason, they say, you should not be making God's decrees into midot rachamim. Like, don't assume you know that the reason why God gave us this law is because of compassion. It can be something else, and don't reduce it to your own human construct. Now, let's look at Nachmanides as he responds to Maimonides in source 15. Remember, Maimonides was the one who said it's all about compassion, right? Don't be compassionate. What was our problem with that? We said, wait a second, that's ridiculous. Like, if that were the case, then we should stop animal sacrifice altogether and slaughtering animals. All of it should be reduced, right? So look at the way Nachmanides argues with Maimonides, they lived around the same time, Nachmanides a little bit later. So right, Maimonides in the guide says the point is that the mother should not have to watch her offspring being killed, since animals have as strong feelings about that as humans do. A mother's love and nurturing of her children do not come from the intellect, but from the imaginative faculty which animals and people alike have. Now that was Maimonides. He quoted Maimonides, right? Now what's he going to do? He's going to say, no. If this were the correct, the main point of Leviticus 22:28 would be to prohibit slaughtering the young first. And the prohibition of the mother first would just be a precaution, right? In other words, you can't, then the prohibition wouldn't mean, it's not just about the day, it just means make sure that you can slaughter the mother so she doesn't see her child, like slaughter the mother. Like he gives his own, like he also said, I didn't bring the entire text here. He said all the things we said, right? If this were, right, so then he says, but it's more correct to say that we are being instructed not to inure ourselves to cruelty. This is a very fine distinction. He says, listen, of course we're allowed to eat meat. And there's a compassionate way to slaughter animals. It's not a compassionate structure, but there are degrees of compassion and degrees of cruelty. He says, slaughtering animals in the most compassionate and humane way is a degree of cruelty that the Torah allowed us to have. Just like war is a degree of cruelty the Torah allowed us to have. But there are rules in war too. And there are also rules in slaughtering animals. And the point is not compassion for the animals, he says, even though, right, of course, it winds up being that way, but to inculcate in us a limit on the cruelty that we as human beings allow ourselves to engage in. He says, it's not that the Holy One takes pity on the nest or on the mother animal and her young. He does not prevent us from doing what we need to do to them, right? God allows us to eat those eggs. But the point is to teach us to be merciful and to prevent us from being cruel. For cruelty spreads easily through the human soul. This is a principle in the 12th century that is an incredible principle. Cruelty spreads easily in the human soul, right? So he's saying, listen, we don't have to reduce this to an argument about veganism and vegetarianism. The Torah is not a utopic document. It allows for human frailty. It allows us to have a degree of cruelty, as it were, right? It's not arguing that all slaughter is cruel and that all war is cruel or that all of these practices are cruel. They are, to some extent, but the Torah allows it. It's human nature. But it limits it. And that this is a fundamental perspective of Nachmanides, and I would argue it's a fundamental perspective. Look at source number 16.
But wasn't he doing the same thing, Maimonides? He's presuming a human motivation to God. It's a slightly different motivation, but it is a human motivation.
Absolutely. It's absolutely a problem. That's also a problem, right? He's in the same camp. He doesn't criticize Maimonides in the way that I said. He doesn't explicitly say it's because you're not allowed to deduce what God's imagination is. Right? He gives certain reasons, but he says you can't have final reasons. Final reasons, he said, are very dangerous. Nachmanides is very clear about that. But he also is a Kabbalist, so he tries to find reasons they're also reasons. It's still a problem. And by the way, you'll see in a moment, everybody logs on. They just jump on, right? Ibn Kaspi, look at Ibn Kaspi, who is also a commentator on Nachmanides in source 16. He writes, summing up, we learned that God has, through this principle, acquainted us with a great part of existential wisdom, and at the same time taught us the quality of modesty and humbleness, or humility, so that we may always bear in mind that we are not very unlike a donkey or a mule, a cabbage or a pomegranate, or even an inert rock, but that God has also instilled in us the quality of compassion to be shown to deserving people, for this was the main reason for the creation of the world. This Ibn Kaspi is quoted, like it's a remarkable text because it essentially says we are all within degrees of removal, like Alan was saying earlier, like we're all a part of the great continuum of being. We're all part of, like in recognizing that even animals have feelings, we realize that we are part of the sentient world and that we have a responsibility toward that world. But he doesn't go so far as to say that the only reason for doing it is compassion. One of the reasons for doing this compassion, it's to inculcate in us the quality of compassion. Now, this is, as I said, a macro problem. To come back to Theo's question and also Nikki's assertion. So, first of all, of course we read these things because if we were to start taking a highlighter and a scalpel to all of the things in the Torah that we find offensive, we would have very little left. And then, we'd also wind up seeing in a couple of years that some of the things that we thought were ridiculous wind up, as mores change, becoming less so. And so it was smart of the rabbis to keep everything where it was and to just evolve, right, the text through human interpretation and human wrestling. That's our approach. If you want, there are people who remove parts of the text that bother them and don't read them in synagogue and don't read them in other places. I would argue that that's a very thin tradition. It's very hard to find an example of that working in the world, so to speak. We have, I think, a smarter tradition of not cut and pasting, but hyperlinking and adding various levels of interpretive gloss that make parts of the Torah, its original place is there, but the branches, as it were, are different. We don't stone people anymore for rebelling against their parents, although sometimes I'm sure parents wish that we reinstated that. We don't burn people for not keeping Shabbat. But I would say that the Torah's general approach, the rabbi's general approach to the Torah, is to say that there is a great need that we have. The approach to cruelty and to practices is similar to the approach to giving reasons. They're similar, which is human beings have an innate predisposition towards cruelty, and the Torah doesn't try to eradicate it, but tries to, like Freud said, to channel it and to subdue it on some level, but to move it in the right directions. And the same thing with our yearning to find ultimate reasons for religious principles and religious texts. That as long as we have some epistemological humility, we can engage our innate yearning for meaning structure and for make sense of things. The danger comes when we think we know more than 2,000 years of other human beings on various things, and we don't hold out the possibility that maybe a little bit of humility goes a long way around knowing things.
Sure, I agree, but my problem comes if we believe that the Torah is the word of God, right? I mean, I know not everybody believes that.
No, even those who don't believe it is the word of God act as if they do.
Okay, so if we believe it, but I personally like that as an idea.
Yeah, exactly.
I really like that as an idea, right? What do we do with the idea that yes, we should be good to the stranger and not, compassion is important. Be good to your neighbor. All of these things, and at the same time, you have this if you desecrate the name of God, everybody should kill you. How do we make sense of that?
We made sense over the last 2,000 years because we believe that the Torah was in a conversation with future generations to unpack its meaning. Like the Torah doesn't stand. We're not fundamentalists. There were a sect of Jews that took the Torah at its face value and didn't feel the need to interpret. But interpretation has always been a part of the conversation between us and God, and us and the Torah. So the entire rabbinic tradition is a conversation with those texts, seeking to understand them, seeking to apply them, seeking to wrestle with them, seeking to sometimes nullify them. Right? The rabbis gave themselves great license, but they never thought, at least I don't believe they did, that they were doing it without God's express wishes. God wanted us to take the Torah and bring it into, from heaven down to earth.
So it's
only to the extent that we study more and more of rabbinic literature, we will find ourselves more and more aligned as moderns with the rabbis and their enterprise.
So you're saying that as we evolve, God evolves as well?
That's a radical way of saying what I'm saying, but I would say that, and I prefer at this point in my life and career to be a little bit less radical. There is a 2,000-year tradition of people just like us sitting around. Unfortunately, not a lot of women, but now, thankfully, over the last 100 years or so, or maybe a little longer, right? But humans sitting around the table saying, what did God mean when God said this? And what do we think God meant? And one said, no, I think God meant this. And one said, and we're not unique in struggling with the text. There's not a moment where you can find in the 13th century rabbis reading the text saying, wait a second, how does this relate? And how does this interact? And that's called Midrash. And that's called Mishnah. And that's called Talmud. And that's called Kabbalah. And that's called Hasidut. We have 2,000 years of community of skeptics saying, how do we walk out compassion if this is what the Torah says? We might not like their answers sometimes, and we have our own, but we're not unique in our frustration and our feeling that some things are not in alignment. I wanted to show you a late 18th century Hasidic text on this source. There are clearly a lot more comments. Go ahead. Those who haven't spoken yet. So go ahead, Jesse. And then
I wanted to say something after Jonathan mentioned something to me, and I want to say something in commentary before Jonathan said. Do you mind if he shares and then I share? Very quickly.
sure.
Well, I was just going to say that Nachmanides is like it feels like, ta-da, like I finally heard someone talk about this balance. And of course, I can't help but think about what's happening right now in Israel and the necessity and the question of the necessity to fight and to actually engage in warfare. And lest we gloat or lest we lose our humanity in the process, Nachmanides is warning us to not.
Right.
So it is a tempering of cruelty.
Yeah. I think that there is something in the Nachmanides text that very much spoke to me about this moment too, and understanding. Although I have reservations about some of the requests that in our own community for certain things around the conflict. I have my own conflict around it, my own conversation. But I in this fear of being that cruelty spreads easily in the human soul, that principle from Nachmanides is very powerful. And I think that that it is a danger. Like it is a danger once you start down the path of permissible cruelty, right? There you can lead, and somebody can coarsen the soul, it can harden the heart, and so on. And I think that there's a lot of fear in Nachmanides' text, fear of what would happen.
Right.
And he's reading the Torah saying, right, that that there are permissible, here's a structure called korbanot, like sacrifices. Nachmanides would never come out and say, how could the Torah command us to sacrifice animals? What did they ever do to anybody? It's factory farming, but in a religious way.
Right.
Like he would never say that. First of all, it would just be anachronistic. It would make no sense. But what he's saying in the 13th century is something very profound. He's saying, here we have this system. It's, it has its reasons. I get it. And then we have this law, and I'm going to see this law as the system's paying, mandating a certain level of inoculating yourself against the cruelty that spreads easily in the soul. And he knows the danger of saying it's all about compassion. Again, he's familiar with this danger of giving reasons for mitzvot. He himself gives reasons, but also continually says, ultimately we don't understand, because he's afraid of the reform that would come in the 19th century in Germany. He's afraid of throwing out whole cloth pieces of the tradition and being left with just an emaciated Judaism that's just ethical culture, right? Ethical culture is kind of an emaciated. I have a Torah at home that's called, it's a modern Torah, whatever it is, and it's basically wisdom from everywhere. It's like a book of wisdom, and it's so beautiful, but it's nice for one person. I don't think you're ever going to be able to build a Judaism where you remove whole cloth pieces that are 2,000 years old without major damage. Yeah. I would say, Jesse, you were going to say that, and then Tomas.
Yeah. So what I was feeling, responsive to is that idea of giving up pacifism, right? That given what we've gone through and what maybe is anticipated and what our whole history, right? We can't be a pacifist people, right? We have to be able to have self-defense. We have to be able to have a right to defend ourselves. And so this level, this discussion of what it means, what are the limits in terms of defending ourselves, because the implication in the text is that we have to eat meat. Today we know we don't have to eat meat, but in the text there's this understanding we have to eat meat, and so for our survival we have to be cruel, right? We have to kill these animals, but we don't want to be so cruel. We want to have some limits to it. And yet in the text, as you're saying, which is so fascinating, and what Theo brought up too, is like this contradiction. There's this constant contradiction. And so we're constantly grappling with what does it mean to defend ourselves and how cruel can we be? Or how do we address that in ourselves? Because today, I think many of us would say, no, we can't kill animals. There's no reason. They're Olympic athletes. We're vegan. You know, it's not necessary. And so the text itself and the contradiction gives us the space to constantly be looking at, well, what are the limits of cruelty?
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument, I think it's a much bigger argument, I think, about the ethics of animal consumption and measures that are in place to regulate it, both from an affective and from a legal perspective, and the animal rights and animal feelings and human feelings. I think, obviously eating meat is not is not always a privilege to not eat meat. And if you're in places where if you're in Tibet and other places where agrarian cultures don't, certain facts on the ground make it impossible. Like there are arguments to be made for eating meat. There are arguments to be made against eating meat. There's certainly no argument to be made for industrial farming and its impact on both animals.
It's metaphorical. Is what
No, I understand, but I'm saying, but metaphorically speaking, it's a similar structure here. It's like it's almost the utopic ideal of having a world where there is no violence and no cruelty presumes that everyone has evolved to the place where they don't use aggression. And so those who the West, let's say, who are in an ideal say, would use arguments and words to disagree, right? The state and its power, Foucault's interrogation of that, it's like a lovely ideal. Like, would it be that people, that human beings didn't have the ability to devolve and act in ways that are out of alignment, even with their own principles and the human mind? So I think that compassion, cruelty towards another can often be compassion towards one's own,
Right, that's what I'm saying.
and in some cases, compassion towards a greater, right? To rid the world, like some would say that chemotherapy is lacking compassion towards the body, but tell that to people who have survived cancer and needed it to be allopathic and not homeopathic, and so there's a lot to be said for this conversation. And so within this broader conversation about cruelty and about the text, there was also the bigger conversation about whether or not, when we give reasons which we are innately predisposed to try to affix to a given thing, is there somehow shadow to that? And I would say there is. And the broader argument about religion itself and the religion that is rooted in choice as opposed to religion that is rooted in tradition is a sub conversation about this conversation, which is and if people want, after Shabbat or something next week, I can send an article from my friend, my colleague, Professor Michal Biton. It was a sociologist of American Judaism, who wrote a very, very powerful piece about the dangers of DIY Judaism and the do-it-yourself Judaism that is rooted in choice and rationale and so on, and asking questions, which of course we all think of as an ethic that is endemic to the liberal project and so on, which of course it is. And we often don't talk about the byproducts of that. And she articulates it perfectly. And I'm happy to send that, but I think that it's in this conversation about like, hey, look at this piece of Torah. Ugh, like, I'm not going to do that. That's no, Anyway, so Tomas has been so patient. And then the Rebbe from the Miashalach. Yeah.
Briefly, in honor of the hour, just I'm struggling a little bit about the connection between the learning that we do at this table and the act of sacrifice. And there seems to be a connection that is paradoxical, because all we do here on Saturday morning is try to find out the reasons for things. Like why? But why? And if you find out too many reasons, all you are left with is reason. And you lose religion or whatever else we call the unreasonable, the spiritual or the irrational or the magical or the mystical. And so how much reasoning is enough reasoning? And I don't have a reasonable explanation for that.
Exactly.
But my intuition is that there's a connection to sacrifice, because there's a relationship between rationality and transactionality. So the transaction, the seeming transaction of sacrifice is, if I do this here in the earth below, so it shall be in the heavens above. If I'm kind to this bird, maybe Hashem will be kind to me. In a way, that's good enough because it brings some virtue into the world, perhaps. But in a way, a tragedy because it turns sacrifice into transaction. Sacrifice just means to make holy, literally to make sacred in English. That's all it means. But we've adopted it to this other meaning back to about the 16th, 17th century, meaning, okay, I'm just giving something up in hopes of a reward, which turns it into a transaction. Like if I give up this delicious food and burn it to some priest, maybe I'll never be hungry again.
Yes.
And that transactionality, that rationality, desacralizes the sacrifice.
Yes.
And so in my own Jewish education, I especially struggled with kashrut. And you know, I remember standing in somebody's kitchen in LA and like, I forget what we were doing. It just seemed wild to me. And I was like, why? She just said, we just do it. And I was like,
Yeah.
That makes
So
sense.
I'll say, so I'm not going to get to the Me'ashilach. If you guys want to read the Me'ashilach, it's really, it's a tour de force. It has in it everything that Tomasha said, which is in the Me'ashilach, who lived in the 18th century, he was a deeply traditional Jew and a very, extremely Orthodox. He was a Hasidic Rebbe. And he was also, for those who've been studying for a couple of years here, know that he was also very subversive. And he was a Kabbalist, a Hasidic master. But he essentially raises the tension between the rational and the transactional, between the search for meaning and its tension with making God in our own image. And I think that this is Michal Bitan's argument, and it's the reason why all of this really struck me so powerfully, which is that there is a deep danger in the irrational sacrifice or surrender. And this is why the question of how much is exactly the right question. And it's also, once you ask the question, you are also, the question itself as it arises is both the solution, the question itself as it arises is both the beginning of a solution and the beginning of a problem. Because once unleashed, and this is Michal Bitan's argument, when you lived in a traditional society where you were immersed in the tradition, you didn't ask a question because it just was what you did.
Yeah.
Like you didn't stand outside of the tradition that you were in to interrogate it and say, like, I wonder why I'm making a blessing over this food. You just made a blessing